At the auction, the son of the best farmer chose the weakest horse. Everyone laughed, thinking it was doomed. But what happened next shocked the whole town. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which town you are from. The sun was only beginning to climb above the horizon when the wagons and trucks began to roll toward the fairgrounds at the edge of the county seat. Dust hung in the cool morning air, stirred up by the tires and hooves that pressed over the gravel paths, and the sound of countless voices rose into the pale sky like the first hymn of the day. It was auction morning, a tradition as old as the settlement of the valley itself, and the people who came knew that this was more than business. It was a gathering, a reckoning, and a chance to measure one's place among neighbors. The smell of frying food mingled with the sharper tang of livestock, while laughter and shouts echoed through the barns where men and women gathered to bargain, gossip, and compete in their subtle ways. At the center of this world moved Jack Milton. He walked with the bearing of a man whose name carried weight, though he did not speak loudly or boast of what he had achieved. His face bore the creases of years spent beneath the sun, his clothes were plain but clean, and his stride betrayed the endurance of a man still accustomed to long days in the saddle. Around him, people nodded respectfully, some even raising their hats, for his ranch was known across 3 counties. The Milton farm had produced champions, not only in cattle, but especially in horses. For decades, his animals had carried riders to victory in county fairs, rodeos, and work contests that tested strength and skill. Jack had become a kind of quiet legend, the man whose animals seemed born with more heart and endurance than the rest. Walking beside him was his 10-year-old son, Tom. The boy kept his shoulders straight, though his wide eyes betrayed the excitement that coursed through him. For Tom, the auction was more than a chance to see fine animals. It was an initiation, a step into the world of men where decisions had weight and choices shaped futures. His small boots kicked up dust as he hurried to keep pace with his father, and every glance he cast toward the corrals revealed his hunger to be part of this tradition. Jack let the boy walk slightly ahead, watching him out of the corner of his eye, measuring how he absorbed the sights and sounds. He knew this day would mark the beginning of his son's education in ways books and schools could not provide. The auctioneer's voice rang out from the main barn, already beginning the first sales of the morning. Cattle were led forward, sleek and strong, fetching high bids from ranchers eager to improve their herds. Men slapped each other on the back, deals were sealed with firm handshakes, and the rhythm of buying and selling moved with the precision of a dance. For Jack, it was familiar ground. He had bought and sold here for 30 years, and though the faces around him sometimes changed, the ritual remained the same. As the morning progressed, the attention of the crowd shifted to the horses. Tall thoroughbreds and sturdy quarter horses were paraded before eager eyes. Bids rose quickly for those whose lines promised strength and speed, and the auctioneer's gavel fell again and again, punctuating the air with finality. Jack's gaze was calm and discerning. He studied the legs, the eyes, the movements of each animal with the knowledge of a man who had judged more horses than he could count. Tom mirrored him, craning his neck to see, imitating the way his father's eyes traveled from flank to hoof. Then the mood in the barn shifted. A horse was led forward that drew no admiration. It was a young gelding, thin to the point of gauntness, his ribs visible beneath a dull coat that should have shone like copper, but instead looked like dust. Scars marred his side, and his mane hung in tangled clumps. The animal's head jerked nervously, ears pinned back as if expecting a blow. The crowd reacted with laughter and dismissal. Men muttered that it was hardly worth the feed to keep such a creature alive. Even the auctioneer's tone grew flat, as though he already knew there would be no real interest. Jack's eyes lingered only briefly. To him, it was clear that this was an animal destined for the lowest end of the trade, perhaps slaughter, perhaps abandonment. He shifted his weight, preparing to turn away, but Tom stood transfixed. The boy's gaze was locked on the horse, his breath caught as though he recognized something no one else could see. He moved closer to the railing, his small hands gripping the wood, his eyes never leaving the animal that trembled under the indifferent stares of the crowd. The laughter of nearby men rose louder. They mocked the very idea that such a beast could serve any purpose. For them, the horse was a symbol of failure, a lesson in what not to buy. They joked that only a fool would put money on such a wreck. Jack heard them, and though his instinct was to agree, he also felt the weight of his son's silent plea. The boy's expression was not one of pity alone. It was something deeper, a quiet determination, as if he had found a challenge meant only for him. The auctioneer called for bids, his voice half-hearted. Silence followed, then a few chuckles. No hands rose. The gelding shifted uncomfortably, pulling against the rope as though he already sensed the futility of his existence. Tom turned toward his father with eyes bright with urgency. Though he said nothing aloud, he did not need to. Jack read it in the boy's face. The conviction that this horse mattered, that he deserved another chance. Jack hesitated, his thoughts tangled. Logic told him the purchase would be foolish. His reputation as a breeder of fine horses might suffer. The animal represented nothing but risk, and his neighbors would not let him forget it. Yet beneath those calculations stirred a memory of his own youth, when choices were made not for profit but for principle, when an animal's worth was judged not only by what it could do, but by the chance it deserved. He looked again at the horse, at the raw nerves in its eyes, and then at his son, whose small frame seemed almost to vibrate with hope. The decision came with a weight he could feel in his chest. Slowly, almost against his own will, he raised his hand. The crowd turned toward him with disbelief. The auctioneer's gavel struck, and the horse was his. Laughter rippled through the barn, accompanied by muttered remarks about wasted money and foolish sentiment. Jack ignored them outwardly, though inside a knot of doubt tightened. He wondered if he had just jeopardized more than his pride by yielding to a boy's untested instinct. When they led the gelding toward the Milton truck, the horse moved reluctantly, as though accustomed to harsh treatment. Tom followed close behind, his face shining with a pride and joy that no amount of ridicule could dim. Jack watched, torn between unease and an unexpected warmth. The boy had wanted this animal, had believed in him when no one else did. Perhaps, Jack thought, that belief was worth more than the money he had spent. The drive back to the farm was long, the roads stretching across fields that had known their family for generations. Jack sat in silence, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind replaying the laughter of his peers. He imagined the whispers that would follow, the jokes that would circulate at the feed store and in the pews of Sunday church. He had risked his standing for a horse that seemed destined to prove them all right. Yet glancing in the rearview mirror, he saw his son leaning against the side of the trailer, eyes fixed on the animal as if keeping vigil. The boy's expression was one of fierce loyalty, and Jack recognized in it something he had not expected, the spark of a future that might outshine his own. As the truck turned onto the familiar gravel path leading to the Milton Ranch, the barns and pastures coming into view, Jack drew a slow breath. Doubt still gnawed at him, but beneath it lay a faint stirring of possibility. He had given his son the gift of responsibility, of belief against the odds. Whether it proved wise or foolish, only time would tell. For now the horse stood in the trailer, a creature no one else had wanted, and the boy sat beside him with the unshakable certainty that he was meant for something greater. The day had begun with the routine of an auction, but as they rolled into the yard of the farm, Jack knew their lives had quietly shifted onto a new path, one that neither reputation nor ridicule could fully define. The return to the ranch marked the beginning of a new chapter in the life of the Milton family. The truck rattled into the yard, its trailer creaking beneath the weight of the new horse, and the sounds of the familiar farm wrapped around them like an old song. Chickens clucked and scattered before the wheels, dogs barked from their posts near the barn, and the faint lowing of cattle drifted across the fields. For Jack, it was all routine, the endless rhythm of the land and the animals that had shaped his days for decades. But when his eyes moved to the trailer, where the gelding shifted uneasily against the wooden slats, he felt the strain of a new uncertainty settle upon his shoulders. The horse was led carefully into an empty stall, his hooves clattering against the wooden boards as though even the ground resisted his presence. He stood tense and restless, eyes rolling with mistrust, muscles twitching as if expecting pain. The other horses, sleek and steady, watched with the aloof curiosity of creatures accustomed to order. They sensed the disruption, the intrusion of something wild and unstable into the harmony of the barn. Jack closed the gate with deliberate care, the latch snapping shut with a finality that felt heavy. He lingered there for a moment, studying the animal that had cost him not only $50 but also the certainty of his reputation. Tom, however, saw none of this weight. He hovered near the stall, his small hands clutching the rail, his face alight with the glow of possession and responsibility. To him, the horse was not a mistake, but a promise, a challenge that his young heart was eager to embrace. He spoke no words, but his presence carried an energy of devotion that needed no explanation. He had chosen this horse when no one else would, and already he seemed bound to it by something stronger than reason. The first days were difficult. The gelding refused grain, turning his head sharply whenever feed was offered. He backed into the corners of the stall, eyes wide and nostrils flaring whenever anyone entered. When Jack tried to approach, the horse lashed his tail and stamped, the whites of his eyes flashing in defiance. More than once he lunged suddenly at the rail, teeth bared, forcing even the experienced farmer to step back. Jack muttered under his breath, though never loud enough for Tom to hear, that perhaps the others had been right. This was an animal too far gone, one whose spirit had been warped beyond repair. Yet Tom did not retreat. Each morning before school, he rose early and padded through the cool dawn air to the barn. He stood patiently before the stall, offering feed in small amounts, holding out water, waiting for the animal to come to him. He stayed after chores in the evenings, brushing the dull coat in long strokes, even when the horse flinched beneath the bristles. He spoke in the low, steady tones of childhood that carried no authority, only sincerity. And though the words meant nothing to the horse, the intent seemed to reach him. Slowly, in increments so small that only a boy's unwavering gaze could detect them, the gelding's hostility softened. By the second week, he no longer turned away from the feed bucket. By the third, he allowed Tom to touch his shoulder without recoiling. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. Where Jack had seen a creature defined by its scars, Tom saw glimpses of the animal hidden beneath, glimpses of a strength not yet spent. The boy's patience became a ritual, a devotion that filled his days with purpose. And though Jack rarely admitted it aloud, he began to notice the changes too. But the neighbors did not let him forget. At the feed store, men raised eyebrows when they heard about the new acquisition. They whispered to one another that Jack Milton had lost his edge, that age had softened his judgment. When they visited the ranch, their eyes lingered too long on the stall where the thin gelding stood, their smirks betraying their opinion before a word was spoken. "That horse'll break the boy's heart," one man remarked as he leaned on the fence, though Jack ignored him outwardly. Still, the words clung like burrs. He wondered each night, as he sat alone at the kitchen table, whether he had indeed done his son a disservice by indulging his compassion. Yet Tom persevered. He rose before the sun, sometimes with sleep still heavy in his eyes, and went to the barn with the certainty of one who had made a promise. He brushed the coat until it began to gleam faintly under the light, revealing hints of a chestnut hue that had been hidden beneath neglect. He cleaned the hooves, spoke gently when the horse shivered, and brought fresh hay with hands that were small but willing. Jack watched from the doorway more than once, silent, hidden in shadow. What he saw stirred conflicting emotions: pride in the boy's resolve, doubt in his own decisions, and a recognition that something was unfolding that lay beyond his control. The months passed, marked by seasons turning across the land. Winter's chill seeped into the barns, frost crusted the fields, and still Tom tended his horse. The animal, once a figure of ridicule, began to fill out. Muscles grew firm beneath the coat, ribs no longer jutted, and his movements took on a grace that surprised even Jack. He remained spirited, sometimes even unruly, but his eyes no longer carried the wild desperation of an animal waiting for cruelty. Instead, there was a watchfulness, a cautious trust that grew each day he spent with the boy. Neighbors began to notice. Their laughter did not vanish, but it softened, tinged now with unease. It was one thing to mock a foolish purchase. It was another to watch that purchase turn slowly into proof of something remarkable. At gatherings, they asked questions in tones that concealed their curiosity. Jack answered briefly, not willing to share more than was necessary, though inside he felt a swelling he could neither dismiss nor fully acknowledge. The horse was changing, but more importantly, so was his son. For Tom, the gelding became more than a project. He became a mirror, reflecting back the boy's own determination and capacity for loyalty. Every small victory, the first time the horse stood still while being saddled, the first time he accepted a bridle without a fight, etched itself into Tom's memory as proof that patience and care could triumph over pain and mistrust. Where the world saw a creature unworthy of investment, Tom saw the embodiment of perseverance. Jack began to understand this in ways that unsettled him. He had always believed success lay in breeding and training, in knowledge honed over years. Yet here was his son, with none of that experience, achieving what seasoned men had dismissed as impossible. It was not science or skill alone that tamed the horse. It was the boy's faith. Jack found himself reflecting on the days when he was young, when he too had once believed in the unseen potential of things, before years of labor and loss had narrowed his vision. Watching Tom reminded him of that earlier self and of how much of it he had let slip away. By spring, the gelding was no longer the frail creature that had walked into the barn months before. He moved with a quiet strength, his muscles sleek beneath a coat that now shone in the sun. He had earned his place among the other horses, not through lineage or price, but through resilience. The neighbors could no longer laugh as they once had, though some still tried. Yet Jack knew, and Tom knew most of all, that something extraordinary was happening. The boy had chosen a horse everyone else had abandoned, and in the process, he had begun to prove himself as something more than just his father's son. He was forging his own path, guided not by experience but by an instinct Jack could no longer ignore. It stirred a restlessness in the father, a recognition that the boy's vision might one day surpass his own. He could not yet say it aloud, but in the quiet of the evenings as he leaned against the fence and watched Tom working beside the horse, he felt both humbled and proud. The trials were not over, of course. There would be setbacks, moments when the gelding's wildness reemerged, times when Tom stumbled in his efforts. But the foundation had been laid. Against ridicule and doubt, the boy had persisted. Against his own hesitation, Jack had begun to believe. The ranch itself seemed to take on a new energy, as if the story of the unwanted horse had breathed life into old routines. The barns, though weathered, felt less burdened by neglect. The fields, though still demanding, seemed to stretch with promise. And within the household, though Martha's absence was still a quiet ache in Jack's heart, there was now a sense of forward motion, of purpose renewed by the bond between boy and horse. Jack knew the day would come when Tom would ask for more, when the horse would be tested beyond the safety of the farmyard. He feared it as much as he anticipated it, for such a moment would reveal not only the horse's true nature, but also his son's. And as the boy grew taller, his shoulders broadening with the first hints of adolescence, Jack saw the shape of the future forming. It was a future in which his own role might diminish, not in failure, but in fulfillment, as his son rose to meet the challenges that lay ahead. Thus the months of trial passed into a season of quiet triumph. The boy and his horse had proven what faith could accomplish, and though the laughter of the neighbors had not wholly disappeared, it no longer carried the sting it once had. Jack carried within him the knowledge that something greater was being born, not only in the horse that now grazed with pride in his pasture, but in the boy who had seen in him what no one else could. And as spring warmed into summer, with the air alive with the hum of cicadas and the fields green with promise, the path toward the next trial began to take shape. Somewhere on the horizon lay the proving ground, the moment when Tom's devotion and the horse's hidden strength would be tested before all who had once doubted. Jack did not yet know how that moment would come, but he sensed it as surely as he sensed the changing of the seasons. The first trials were behind them, but the greatest test was yet to come. The summer came in with its heat, its shimmering days when the earth baked and the air carried the heavy scent of alfalfa and cut hay. On the Milton farm, the rhythms of work moved forward as they always had, but beneath the routine there pulsed a new energy. The gelding, once the broken creature of ridicule, had taken on strength and shine. His coat glimmered in the sunlight, his muscles worked smoothly beneath the skin, and his eyes carried a fire that had been hidden by neglect. Tom had nurtured him, tended him, and given him purpose, and now the results were undeniable. The boy's devotion had created not only a sound horse, but a partnership that was as visible as the long shadows cast across the fields at dusk. Jack watched it all with an uneasy pride. He had not forgotten the laughter at the auction, the whispered doubts in the feed store, the smirks of men who measured worth in dollars and lineage. He had expected their ridicule to fade as the horse improved, but instead it lingered, sharp and persistent, ready to cut deeper. They waited for proof. A horse might look fine in a pasture, but value in their world was measured in the arena, on the track, or in the field where others could see and judge. It was not enough for Jack and Tom to believe in what the animal had become. The community would only yield its respect when the horse proved himself under the public eye. The opportunity came in the form of the county fair, an annual gathering that drew families and farmers from miles around. The fair was more than carnival rides and contests. It was the measure of a year's work, the stage on which reputations were forged or undone. Horses were paraded, cattle judged, and the names of winners repeated for months afterward. Jack had brought many animals to the fair in his life, and more often than not, they had returned with ribbons that enhanced his standing. He knew the value of victory and the sting of defeat. Now he saw in his son's eager eyes the hunger to step into that world, to bring his horse and show the truth of what he had seen when no one else had looked twice. Tom spoke little of it, but his actions revealed his intent. Each morning he rode the gelding farther across the pasture, guiding him into smoother gaits, urging him into steady trots, testing his response to cues. He practiced starts and stops, turns and circles, repeating them until horse and rider moved almost as one. The gelding, once nervous and resistant, now answered the boy's hands and legs with a willingness that surprised even Jack. What had been wild defiance had transformed into a raw eagerness, a desire to prove himself as much as his young master wished to prove him. When word spread that Tom intended to enter the gelding in the fair's working horse competition, the reactions were predictable. Some laughed openly, others shook their heads in disbelief. It was one thing to rescue a broken animal, another entirely to place him against the best-trained stock in the county. "The boy will make a fool of himself," one man muttered at the general store, not realizing that Jack, standing nearby, had heard every word. Jack said nothing, but his silence was heavy, his jaw set in the way it had been when he was younger and forced to defend his own convictions. He knew what was at stake, not just for the horse but for his son, whose faith would be tested in the harshest light possible, the gaze of those waiting for him to fail. The day of the fair dawned clear and hot. The grounds bustled with energy, the air alive with shouts and laughter, the clang of machinery, the smells of fried food and livestock mingling into a haze that clung to every corner. Families wandered through exhibits, children tugged at their parents' hands, and the steady rhythm of auctioneers' voices rolled across the barns. Amid it all, the horse arena stood like a stage. Its rails gleamed in the sun, and the bleachers were already filling with people eager to see who would rise, who would falter, and who would surprise them all. Jack led the truck into the lot and parked among the rows of vehicles that stretched across the field. Tom sat beside him, unusually quiet, his face pale with nerves, though his eyes burned with determination. In the trailer behind them, the gelding shifted, restless, as though he too sensed the weight of the day. Jack looked at his son and, for the first time, felt that the boy had already grown beyond the child he had brought to the auction months ago. There was steel in him now, tempered by long hours of patience, by the ridicule he had endured, by the bond he had built with his horse. When they unloaded the gelding, there was a murmur among the crowd. Recognition sparked in the faces of men who had mocked the animal at the auction. They nudged one another, whispered and smirked, waiting for the spectacle they were certain would come. But as the horse stood in the sunlight, his coat burnished and gleaming, his muscles taut, their expressions shifted. Doubt flickered. This was not the same pitiful creature they had dismissed. Something had changed, and though many would not admit it aloud, they felt a stir of unease. The competition began with the usual demonstrations. Riders guided their horses through a series of tests, showing control, responsiveness, and skill. The best stock moved with grace, their riders confident, their training evident. Applause rang out, ribbons were awarded, and the bar was set high. Then it was Tom's turn. The boy mounted with a steadiness that belied his age, his hands firm on the reins, his back straight. The gelding moved forward under him with a power that made heads turn, his stride smooth and confident. At first, whispers rippled through the crowd. They expected disaster, a stumble, a refusal, some proof that the animal was still broken beneath his polished exterior. But as horse and rider moved through the course, silence fell. The gelding responded to every cue, his head high, his movements precise. Where others faltered, he excelled. Where others hesitated, he surged forward. By the time they finished, the silence had turned in a roar of applause, not polite but genuine, rising from those who could no longer deny what they had seen. Tom dismounted, his face flushed with pride, his hands trembling as he stroked his horse's neck. Jack stood at the rail, his heart swelling with a pride so fierce it almost hurt. He saw in that moment not only the triumph of his son, but the confirmation of something he had suspected. The boy's instinct, his ability to see worth where others saw failure, surpassed even his own hard-earned wisdom. The judges awarded the blue ribbon to Tom and his gelding, and the crowd buzzed with astonishment. Men who had mocked now approached with forced smiles, offering congratulations that barely concealed their chagrin. Neighbors shook Jack's hand, though he could see in their eyes the acknowledgement that something had shifted. His son had proven them wrong, and in doing so, had stepped into a place that Jack himself had once occupied, the place of respect, of quiet authority, of someone whose judgment could not be dismissed. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fairgrounds in gold, Jack stood beside his son and watched the horse graze quietly in the temporary stalls. The ribbon fluttered in Tom's hand, a simple piece of fabric that meant more than words could express. Jack realized with a mixture of pride and humility that the boy had crossed a threshold. He was no longer just learning from his father. He was beginning to surpass him, to carry forward the legacy of the Milton name in ways Jack had never imagined. The fair ended, but its echoes lingered. Stories spread across the county of the boy and his unwanted horse who had triumphed against all odds. The ridicule ceased, replaced by a cautious respect. Yet for Jack, the real transformation was not in the voices of others, but in the quiet certainty that his son had found his path. He had proven himself not only to the community, but to his father, who now understood that the future of the ranch, of the horses, of everything he had built, was secure in hands younger but stronger, steadier, and more full of belief than his own. As they drove home under the blanket of stars, the ribbon tucked safely in Tom's pocket, Jack glanced at his son, who leaned against the seat, exhausted but glowing with quiet triumph. The boy's journey with the horse was far from over, but in the proving ground of the county fair, he had taken his first step into the life that awaited him. And Jack, humbled and proud, knew that the day would come when he would no longer lead, but simply watch as his son carried the legacy farther than he ever could. The ride home from the fair was quiet, broken only by the steady hum of the truck's engine and the occasional restless shifting of the gelding in the trailer behind them. Tom leaned against the passenger window, the blue ribbon clasped in his hands, his eyelids heavy with the exhaustion of triumph. Jack drove with both hands fixed on the wheel, his eyes on the long stretch of road ahead. Yet his mind was elsewhere. The memory of the afternoon replayed itself in endless fragments. The hush that had fallen over the crowd, the way the horse had moved like water flowing over stone, the thunder of applause that followed, and his son standing tall in the arena with his head high and his eyes shining. For Jack, it had been more than a victory at the county fair. It had been a revelation. He had always prided himself on his ability to read animals, to judge their worth, to understand what others overlooked. That skill had made him respected among his peers and had built the reputation of the Milton Ranch. Yet what Tom had done went beyond skill. It was not training or experience alone that had turned the broken gelding into a champion. It was vision, faith, and a quiet conviction that Jack himself had not possessed. The boy had seen what no one else had, and he had proven it before the eyes of the entire county. The ranch looked different when they pulled into the yard that night. The familiar barns and fences stood as they always had, weathered and worn, but beneath the glow of the porch light, they seemed to carry a new weight, as though they had been remade by what had happened that day. Jack helped Tom unload the horse, and together they led him into his stall. The gelding moved with calm assurance, ears flicking forward, eyes soft. No longer the wary creature of months ago. He seemed to know he had earned a place here, not as an outsider rescued from ridicule, but as a symbol of something larger than himself. In the days that followed, word of their victory spread quickly. Neighbors who had once mocked now stopped by the ranch to offer congratulations, their voices carrying a note of respect that had been absent before. At the feed store, men nodded to Jack with a deference that acknowledged not only the horse's success, but also the judgment of the boy who had chosen him. They spoke of Tom with admiration, calling him a natural, a prodigy, a young man with a gift. Jack listened with pride, though he rarely added his own words. Inside, he knew the truth was even greater than they realized. For Tom, the victory was only the beginning. Each morning he rose with renewed purpose, eager to ride, to train, to see how far his horse could go. He spoke little of the ribbon, for to him it was less a prize than a reminder of what patience and faith could accomplish. What mattered more was the bond he had forged, the partnership that deepened with every ride across the fields, every long hour in the saddle. He no longer saw himself as a boy caring for a broken animal. He was a rider, a horseman, someone stepping into a role that felt as natural as the rising of the sun. Jack watched him with a mixture of awe and humility. He saw in his son's hands the beginnings of a skill that surpassed his own. The boy's movements were instinctive, his connection to the horse unspoken, his ability to understand the animal's needs, something that could not be taught. Jack had spent his life learning from trial and error, from years of sweat and hardship. But Tom carried within him a gift that seemed to come from someplace deeper. The father began to realize that the future of the ranch would not simply rest on his shoulders. It was already shifting, moving into the hands of his son, who would carry it farther than Jack had ever dreamed. As summer gave way to autumn, the bond between boy and horse was tested in new ways. They worked the fields, herding cattle across rough terrain, moving with speed and precision that astonished even the most skeptical neighbors. The gelding, once considered useless, proved to be the most reliable horse on the ranch, strong, swift, and tireless. Tom rode him with ease, guiding him through long days and difficult tasks, and together they moved as though born for the work. Jack often found himself pausing in his chores just to watch them, a faint smile tugging at his lips, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. But it was not only pride he felt. There was also a recognition, sharp and humbling, that his time as the central figure of the ranch was drawing to a close. He was still strong, still capable, but he could see in his son the future unfolding. Tom was no longer a boy following his father's shadow. He was becoming his own man, guided by instincts and strengths that Jack knew he could not claim as his own. The realization was bittersweet, like watching the sun set behind the mountains. Beautiful, yet tinged with the awareness that something was ending, even as something else began. The community, too, began to shift in its regard. Where once men had sought Jack's opinion above all, they now asked about Tom, about the boy and his horse, about what they would attempt next. Jack did not resent it. He understood the natural order of things, how generations rose and passed, how knowledge and respect moved from old hands to new. He took quiet satisfaction in knowing that his son was not only ready, but destined to carry forward the legacy. The greatest test came in late autumn, when a storm rolled across the county with sudden violence. Rain lashed the fields, wind tore at the barns, and a section of fencing gave way, releasing part of the herd into the open pastures. It was a crisis that demanded swift action, and Jack moved as quickly as he could, saddling a horse and riding into the storm. But it was Tom who reached the cattle first, his gelding charging through the mud and rain, with a determination that seemed to belong to both of them. The boy rode fearlessly, guiding the animals back toward safety, his voice rising above the wind, his horse responding with unwavering strength. By the time Jack arrived, soaked and struggling against the elements, much of the work had already been done. Tom turned to him with a nod, rain streaming down his face, his eyes bright with the fire of responsibility. In that moment, Jack saw the truth with perfect clarity. His son had surpassed him. The storm passed, leaving broken branches and muddy fields in its wake, but the herd was safe. the ranch secure. That night, as they sat by the fire, the sound of rain still dripping from the eaves, Jack looked at his son and felt a peace he had not known in years. The future was not uncertain. It was here, alive in the boy who had seen worth where others had seen failure, who had proven himself in the eyes of the community, who had saved the ranch with courage and strength. Winter settled over the land, and with it came a quiet rhythm of preparation. The fields lay dormant, the cattle sheltered, the horses tended in their stalls. Jack moved through the days with steady hands, but he no longer carried the burden of wondering what would become of his life's work. He had his answer. He saw it every morning when Tom entered the barn, every afternoon when the boy rode across the fields, every evening when he returned with his horse at his side. The ranch was no longer only Jack Milton's. It was Tom's too, and someday it would be his entirely. The gelding, once unwanted and mocked, had become the symbol of this passing of the torch. He grazed in the pastures with the quiet dignity of one who had fulfilled a destiny greater than anyone had imagined. He was proof that faith could transform ridicule into triumph, that kindness could reveal greatness, that the future often arrived in forms no one expected. To the neighbors, he was a marvel, to the community, a champion. But to Jack, he was something deeper, the living bridge between his own generation and his son's. As spring approached once more, Jack stood at the edge of the pasture one evening, the setting sun casting the fields in gold. Tom rode the gelding across the open land, his posture confident, his movements sure, the horse beneath him responding with seamless grace. Jack watched them, a figure and his mount moving as one against the horizon, and he felt no jealousy, no regret, only pride, and a deep, abiding peace. He had spent his life building, striving, proving himself. Now he could rest in the knowledge that his son would do more, see farther, achieve greater things. The legacy was secure, not in wealth or possessions, but in the spirit of a boy who had believed in a broken horse, and in doing so, had shown the world the power of faith. The night deepened, and Jack turned back toward the house, the sounds of the ranch settling around him like a familiar song. The future no longer weighed on him as a burden. It lived in the laughter of his son, in the steady beat of hooves across the fields, in the promise of generations yet to come. The ranch would endure, the legacy would grow, and all because a boy had once asked for a horse no one else wanted, and a father, despite his doubts, had said yes. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Check out the other videos on the channel for more powerful stories waiting to be discovered. And please share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.